Citizens Assembly, or in Citizen Science, excuse me, and as members of UCD. So we have a lot of people here in the audience in the library, which is lovely to see all the familiar faces and new faces as well. And I know there's a lot of people online. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our speakers today, I'll introduce you to Francesco Pilla, who is an associate professor in the UCD School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy, and his area of expertise is smart cities and in specific geospatial analysis and modelling urban dynamics. His work lies at the intersection between people, cities, and cutting-edge technology with the goal of empowering local communities and building better cities through innovation and citizen participation, enabling communities and citizens to act on pressing environmental issues in their local area. And we'll hear about those details of that, which I look forward to immensely, Francesco. Beside me, we have Associate Professor Mary Kelly-Quinn, who's an applied freshwater ecologist in the School of Biology and Environmental Science, and she's also a member of UCD Earth Institute. Her research focuses on assessment of land use and other human activities on the physical, chemical, and ecological quality of of surface waters, as well as the benefits we depend on from fresh waters. Her projects are varied, ranging from investigations of the impacts of barriers such as weirs, advancing knowledge on biodiversity of small streams, as well as the provision of decision-making supports for management of river ecosystem services. So for everybody here, I'd like you to give a very warm welcome to Francesco. So we'll take questions at the end, but for anyone who's online, if you have questions, you can put them up on the chat, and Liz will shout them out to us when we get to the Q&A session a little bit later on. So we'll start with the questions, and we've kind of had a chat ourselves about them, but hopefully this can be a natural conversation between all of us here. But maybe to begin, Mary, I might start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your research background and what got you interested in citizen science in the first place?
Okay, so you had heard from the introduction there, I describe myself as an applied freshwater ecologist, and I'm using the term ecologist because what I use mainly are what we call biological indicators. So I use life within the rivers and lakes as an indication of prevailing conditions. It's actually a better measure than taking chemical samples. So I suppose it's in that respect that I saw the potential for citizen science, because there are a number of citizen science schemes where we can train citizen science to identify aquatic organisms and then use them as an indication of water quality, and they can report that water quality, so it fills knowledge gaps. And I think that's one of the key messages we want to deliver this morning, is that citizen science is about collecting data to address real scientific questions. And I think in doing that is the only way to keep people engaged, is that they know they're actually contributing knowledge that will be used. So I'll talk a little bit more about that scheme later on. But for the last 3 years, I've been involved with a national group that is made up of people with various interests in citizen science, mainly freshwater citizen science, and also what we call LawPro, which is the local authorities waters program, and we've been trying to coordinate efforts to get off the ground a scheme that will enable people to use biological organisms to determine water quality.
Thanks, Mary. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Francesco, a little bit about your own research background and maybe what got you interested in citizen science as well.
Well, look, I started as an environmental modeler. So what I did is that I just sat on my computer, we used a geographic information system and developed a different kind of environmental pollution models. So I did it for air quality, for noise, for water. And what I found is that basically, whenever I started to develop these models, there was a pain, obviously, but it was boring. But there were some main barriers that which were like the access to data. So the data was very poor. I didn't have hyperlocal data. I couldn't have access to any sort of that kind of data. And also I found a lot of barriers in the take-up of what I was developing. So that's why then I went over to Boston for a bit, started to work with sensors, and I started to see a lot of power in, in deploying these little things at a granular scale to collect hyperlocal data, but also in engaging with the citizens, because at the end of the day, if you don't produce something that is relevant for the local community, you don't have even support to deploy it at the end. So all the models that I developed for the IGPA, GSI, so on and so forth, they, after I did the workshop with stakeholders, they were just shared. Basically, they stay there, nothing happened. Instead, I found that whenever you start to work with citizens, you make them part of what you're doing. You are aware of their problem, their perspective, you make them part of the solution. Then also at the end, you gather basically the support that you need to push your solution onto the local authority and make it actually happen. And so I thought that there is a lot of power in citizen science. And this is why now all my European projects, national projects, they always have a citizen science engagement element.
That's really interesting, Francesco, because you're bringing us full circle from, you know, the beginning of the research all the way into seeing impact on the other side of it, because you have engaged citizens, I guess, you know, for want of a better word, that they're like people living locally.
Because at the end of the day, it is all about having a line that goes from data collection, implementation, to replication and policy. And you don't go to the end if you don't have the support from the citizens and you put pressure on the local authority.
So can I ask you then, Mary, about that? Because you mentioned as well that collaboration part of it. Where, at what point in the research do you bring in the citizens to start that collaboration? Is it generally when you've already thought of the research question and the methodology of there, or are you also incorporating the citizens at this design phase?
I suppose it's a mixture of both. I suppose for me, it would be starting with where I feel citizen science can actually contribute. And that's useful for the project. So I'll give you one example. I'm working on what is called a small stream network project. And so these are just the headwater tributaries. You're talking about streams that are no more than maybe about 2 meters in width. But those streams make up about 75% of the river channel in Ireland. But less than 10% of those are actually on the EPA's monitoring program. So there's a huge gap in information there. So that's where I am at the moment, trying to target citizen science and monitoring those tributaries, because if we can solve problems in the headwaters, then it will sort of permeate downstream and create some improvements. So I'm very much at the start of this project. As I said, I've been working with the national group, trying to look at what is needed to run a successful citizen science project. So I think I mentioned to you that I wrote a paper last year where I laid out a framework for successful citizen science projects, or to operationalize successful citizen science. So it was everything from, you know, the establishment of the project, and I think this is a key point. You have to establish the project, you have to have clear goals. What do you want to do? Coordination is extremely important, you know, because we may engage citizen science, but we walk away and it doesn't sustain the effort. And then you have to think about, well, what are the resources for that? What will they actually need? What sort of training program are we going to have? And ideally, that training program has to be co-developed with your volunteers or your participants. And then there's other issues like, okay, they're going to generate data for you. Who's going to hold the data? Do we need a repository for long-term storage of the data? And prior to the upload, you need a system for capturing the data. And you also need somebody who's going to validate the data, because you want data that are going to be trusted if they're going to be used. And ultimately, what I see is we need national coordination of some of these programs, so that in an ideal world, you can develop what I would call local hubs that are self-sustaining, that you have trained trainers using a sort of a training of trainers approach to get those established. So in what I'm doing, it's very much in its infancy. We have the framework, but we have to populate the framework with the different components that I just mentioned.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think you'll be interested in what the Citizens Assembly report has to say, because I think that the members of that were very interested in all of the research that they heard relating to citizen science as well. Francesco, on that, and Mary also touched on it as well, he said one of the key elements of any citizen science project is having the information to give back to the local communities. Yeah. How do you do that in your work, and what have you found to be helpful in that regard?
What we found is that Well, usually if you look at literature, whenever you run a citizen science activity, there is a very high drop-off rate. So you have like you have a lot of engaged citizens at the very beginning, then almost all drop off after a week or two, and then you're left with a core of 1% of your initial engagement that probably continue the activities on the long term. So what we found is that I mean, from my perspective, at least the problem is that most of the time the citizen science activities are done with the citizens and not for the citizens. And I think the part of the empathy is essential. So empathizing with the citizens and getting their perspective of the problem is essential. So what we do is that what we are adopting in the projects is basically a five-step approach. Usually we define the high-level challenge, could be air quality, traffic, because that is linked obviously to the funds that you have available. Otherwise, you know, like so, like actually, one of my researchers here, Anna, developed some tools to get the local communities to analyze the data themselves, even if they don't have any data mining expertise. So she developed some tools in Google Sandbox, and basically the citizens were able to extract very run complicated analysis of the traffic data and extract like patterns, and then eventually for the fifth step to actionate the data. So then use the data to go and complain to the local authorities and say, look, that's the data analysis, that's what is wrong here, we need the traffic measure. And we use this process as part of we count. Now we're trying to replicate those in iChange, and we found that actually some local community managed to use the data themselves and get traffic calming measure in the local authority. Obviously, the local authority got scared because first thing the citizens had the data and they didn't, and second, they actually so inside they started from the data that was the local authority never knew about it.
Great. So it's real empowerment. I love to hear it. I actually participated in an EPA air quality citizen science project last year out of interest, because I was really interested in, well, how will they communicate with me to make sure I keep engaged with it? And it was phenomenal. And I just was so appreciative of all the planning with the regular emails, the infographics. And I had, you know, put the suggestion up in our local WhatsApp group, and loads of neighbours had got involved in it. And they were so proud that the air quality in our area was better than it was, you know, 5 kilometres down the road. But I really think that, well, no, I mean, that's how Irish people will do. But having been living in a poor area, I do think it would have engaged people to actually do something about it. So,
because if you think like, especially if you look at traffic or pollution, most of the time, people can go and not go beyond the complaining on Twitter or Facebook, you know, like, and I think, well, you know, like, I think some people got obsessed instead of checking the weather, they started to check the
that's brilliant. Mary, on that line as well, like, what do you see as the potentials for citizen science, and then like, what can it do? What have you seen in your own projects that you've been involved in?
Well, certainly from a research perspective, it contributes to the data, but it has two other benefits. inputs. And part of that is awareness generation, particularly where the projects are focused at local level. I guess Francesco said that's where it's most important. And that's why I'm working with LawPro, which is the local authorities water program. And they're working with communities to generate first awareness that there's an issue. And for many people, they're absolutely shocked at how poor water quality is in their area. And then they begin to think, well, what can we do to improve conditions? And the first step is, well, let's have a look at the extent of the problem. So that's where I'm involved in training citizen sciences as well. So I go out with them into the field and we visit sites and we show them what the issues are. And then they get together with others and they begin to survey their areas. And you have that awareness first of all, and then it's a reconnection with nature, and then the potential to influence policy and change behavior. And that's what LawPro is looking for. They're looking for change in behavior, especially among landowners. So we do some work with farming communities, landowners, etc. And again, just showing them how they can track changes in their own water quality, particularly where they're going to invest effort in measures to reduce impact of, say, pollution inputs. They want to see return for that. And we can use these schemes to very simply show them how to do that. But I think another important point about citizen science is this aspect of sustaining effort and to realize that not everybody wants to be engaged all the time. So you have to design schemes that allow people, say, to be just spotters, we call them, that can just give you the occasional record, through to schemes where you have continuous monitoring. And that's partly what we've done is we have developed 2 schemes and we've developed the resources that will support that training as well.
So you build in like a scale of engagement according to who's going to be involved.
Absolutely, yeah, from spotter through to adult monitor.
That's really interesting. And can you tell me, Mary, about the training here? Because I think sometimes researchers can be a little bit anxious about having people who aren't necessarily trained in data collection, etc., actually collecting data. And as you said, you know, it needs to be reliable. So what's the type of training that you give for your projects?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you take my project, which is looking at using freshwater indicators, biological indicators to determine water quality. So we're using what are called invertebrates. These are animals without backbone. So you might have heard of mayflies and stoneflies and caddisflies. So we train the citizens to identify them to a level which is manageable, where there's less chance of making errors, but the data are still very useful for determining water quality. And they're also useful to give us an indication of, say, biodiversity in areas where we don't have that information. So I would normally provide 3 to 4 workshops for citizens working with 6 or 7 people. So I would borrow microscopes from UCD, bring them to a location so that they can see the animals, say, under a microscope, first of all, just to appreciate the complexity and the beauty and just the features that we need to identify them. So I'd spend maybe 2 workshops working in a lab environment, and then I bring them into the field and we collect samples and see the living specimens, and they use hand lenses. So there's a lot of training in using the different pieces of equipment to actually do the job. So it takes about 4 workshops until I'm sort of semi-confident that they can do the job. And then I go back and we do a refresher course with them. But there is a dropout rate. Not everybody is keen to stick the pace and get to what it takes. And the ideal for me would be to have, as I say, local hubs where you'd have somebody who's confident enough to support the group in identification, because we're dealing with a small number of people that are actually doing this job, and it's not possible. I've done training from Cork to Wisconsin to Wicklow, etc. And it just takes a lot.
I don't know how you manage it all, but it brings me to a question of recruitment and then finding citizens to participate. Like, do you use networks like, I don't know, men's sheds and things like that? I can imagine my retired dad now would probably be a great one to check out the motorbikes and everything like that. But like, what do you have to kind of target the specific networks depending on the project?
Yeah, well, I think this is the value of the national group, because we're working with LawPro, who have the contacts with the local communities, and it's through them that I have recruited people to engage in the
Okay,
programs.
so having somebody.
Yes.
who's got a
So
similar-
I haven't cut out a widespread call. You get really swamped with requests. You know, there's a great appetite there for citizen science.
Mhm.
And I think it's to capitalize that, but to do it in a way that we can actually sustain the effort, that we're not overwhelmed and then the project collapses completely.
Okay, and how about you then, Francesco, in recruiting your citizens, how easy or difficult do you find that?
Well, I developed a passion for videos, so I got like a video maker from Barcelona that is making me fancy videos for the recruitment, and then I go on the social media. So we did that for the traffic monitors, for the air quality, for the weather stations. So they went out by easily. Got also for the bike library, got a lot of requests. But then you see, then you have to be careful what you wish for, because then you have way too many requests and more than you can handle. So now what we are doing, we are partnering with Antasca most of the times, which they are fantastic. So especially for the activities that we are doing in school, we're finding like very, very handy because they are everywhere. They know how to deliver the workshop. They are great with kids. And then basically we use an approach like training. So get them to understand how to use our sensors, and then they spread out. So in this way, they benefit from our technology, and we benefit from their expertise and power. But the problem is that, going back to the number of workshops, is that we found that sometimes we tend to underestimate the problems with the technology that we are using. And sometimes it works great when you are in your office, and it doesn't work anymore when you're there. And they are full of sensors, are always full of surprises, unfortunately. And so that becomes like something that you have to bear in mind at the very beginning, otherwise it becomes like a problem.
And how do you deal with that? Do you have someone full-time who's able to?
Well,
I
I have a big research team, but well, also I can confirm this year. Sorry, I'm not starting to you, but I can see you. But it is unfortunately we have an awful lot of questions. Sometimes now at the moment we are actually considering removing some of the air quality sensors and replacing them with a different unit.
Okay.
And that is probably the most effective solution that we can have instead of targeting every single time.
Okay, so there's a lot of
Yeah,
in the moment decision making and problem solving.
If you work with technology, it is a challenge.
And Mary, I see you nodding in fact.
Yeah, it's a lot of effort. It really is, yeah. And you do lose contact with groups, and you just wonder when they're doing it. So in the absence of that oversight or national coordination, certainly for the programs that I'm running, I just can't see it being sustained.
Right.
So I have written a position paper that I submitted to the BA, emphasising that look, if you do need to get coordination of this, they can contribute very valuable data, but they need the supports.
And that data, it just isn't there otherwise, as you've both said. So it's necessary to have this input. Okay, I'm going to open the floor to open the floor to questions and the online chat as well. Okay, great.
We'll get to the room and then we'll come back to
Correct. Okay. Are there any questions from the floor right now? I was actually going to just say it and then I'll come back. Oh, but we have them already. So we've one here and one from Sandra, and we've one back as well. Jane, are you happy to go around?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Do you want to go first, Sandra, then?
Okay,
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Jane. This is really fascinating, I think, and getting a sense of what's involved for the researchers and the PIs leading these initiatives. It's very time consuming. Should it be, or is it like an eligible cost in research grants? Like is there a way that policy and funding can support the work?
I know from a number of my grants, I've written in the citizen science element just to emphasize the importance of it, but also to gather some data as well. Yeah. And some of the funding bodies are encouraging us to consider citizen science, but again, it's difficult to get enough resources just to support it to the level that we need to do it.
And is that a lack of understanding and awareness of the power of citizen science on behalf of the funders at the moment? Or is it that it hasn't necessarily been utilised as often as it could be?
I think it's probably a combination of those. I don't think it has been utilised, but I mean, there's a lot of literature written about the accuracy of citizen science data, and you know, whether you're going to actually train them to a level that you have a confidence in the data.
Okay, so it's perhaps there needs to be some give and take on it.
Absolutely,
Right.
it's a growing area.
Yeah. Jane, if we can get the microphone over here.
Sure.
The guy in the back, thank you.
Thank
You want to introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Jeremy Auerbach in geography. So some of the folks that may benefit the most from citizen science, there's barriers for them to participate, mental, physical, socioeconomic barriers. How and what kind of strategies do you employ to ensure that it's equitable and the products are also equitable?
Thanks, Jerry. So I guess diversity in all stuff, yeah.
Look, I can give an answer talking about the experience that we have in one of my projects. So in specific, I could talk about Recount, which was about, it was a project folded under the WAP scheme of the Horizon 2020, so science with and for society. And it was purely a citizen science project. So the budget was just for citizen science activities in 6 cities. So what we had as a remit back then, it was to engage at least 25% of our users in disadvantaged areas, which became a challenge to do, because once you open a call in Opera, it's hard to target it specifically in a geographical way. But then we found that, and we were a lot worried about the technology that we were using, which was a camera installed in a house, private house, looking outside. So with all the, you know, it was GDPR compliant, but obviously nobody can say we having a camera in the window looking in the garden, you know. So it turns out that citizens are more willing to participate in respect, and somewhat that those barriers kind of blowed away when we were doing the workshops. So during the workshops, we didn't use any specific strategy rather than trying to target specific areas. And the diversity within the workshop was quite it was quite okay, even if the technology was very you know, yeah. So but said that, I wouldn't it would be tricky to I don't actually know where to start, to be completely honest, to develop to target specifically diversity in design phase. So if you have any ideas, I'll take that look.
Maybe work on.
Liz would like to ask a question.
I'm gonna, Liz, can I let you take over actually for a minute, because I'm gonna get distracted on it.
So there's a sort of quite a nice follow-on question from El Gadias online, and he asks what criteria one could use to engage or exclude certain citizens. So he says, for example, I'm working on the coastal area and my project intends to engage local communities, but how far inland should I go to consider myself a researcher who has engaged citizens? Is there anything further you have to add?
Objectives of the project. And I think if it's based at a local level with local communities, that can help define the spatial extent of the sampling that's required.
And I'll just ask one more question. So this is from Maeve Boland. We've got 4 questions online and we'll sort of try and oscillate backwards and forwards. So she asks, what are the ethical considerations and clearances needed to involve citizens in research?
Well, we need to go for ethical approval in UCD, which is something quite
thorough exercise.
Yeah. So I guess for us, as we are working with technology, there is the element of the position tracking most of the time. So the GPS. We have the element of the camera, so you have to make sure that whenever you deploy this kind of technology, you take away all the personal information. So there is all the part about aggregating the data, storing it in a safe place. So you have it in a computer in a locked room. how to share the data, the possibility for the citizen to withdraw from the story. So there are a lot of things that you have to take into consideration.
As
Mary,
well, the
you spoke-
additional
sorry,
thing
yeah.
that I would have to take into consideration is whether a license is required to sample in particular areas. So if I'm within a national park area, I need to have a license. I need to think about whether there are protected species, whether there are times of the year that citizens shouldn't be sampling, you know, for example, during the fish spawning season. So we do think about all of those areas, as well as biosecurity and, you know, how you treat your equipment as you go from river to river, so that you're not transferring diseases, for example.
And on that as well, Mary, we spoke about the element of insurance and having to think about that as well.
I mean, this is a complete unknown at the moment. You know, I run workshops and I'm comfortably covered by UCD insurance, but into the future, who is going to be responsible if there is an accident and somebody goes out into the field, breaks a leg or whatever? Nobody has answered that question, so unless you've had experience of that.
Bikes at the moment, so I'm giving away around 200 bikes to schools. So the insurance is the main thing, not just for the assets, but also for the people cycling.
So maybe this is somewhere where UCD can help us try and clarify what we can do.
Yeah,
Because we can't upscale it until we address that question.
but I was about to say that, like, it seems from the conversation that we've talked about the merit of doing citizen science, and particularly in the fact that it's engaged, it's democratic research, it's getting data people wouldn't ordinarily have. So it's contributing, but there is an awful lot of organizational elements and details to consider in the beforehand, in the planning stage. And perhaps this is something that it's an area that structurally UCD could perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it's for me, it's a key area. The question has to be addressed.
Yeah, we certainly thought that we might be able to have specific information about that on the website. So we went to various people in UCD to ask the question, but like yourselves, we have received no satisfactory information. It's nothing that you could put on a website anyway.
Yes, the conversation
Yes.
might start.
Yes.
James, we have another question down the back, if you don't mind giving the microphone over to the corner. Thank you.
Yourself, sorry.
Thank you. Conor McDermott from the School of Archaeology. Just as further info on the point you were making before my question, we run community excavations where, after a lot of effort and working with CERC office, we have been able to have members of the community come along and participate in excavations. These are people with no previous training, uncertain health conditions. So if you do the paperwork, it's doable. It's not, it is onerous, but we have found that there was a willingness there with UCD. But yeah, a lot of paper. My question would be, getting buy-in from the non-citizen partners or stakeholders. So for example, we've heard local authorities mentioned, there will be government departments, there will be commercial entities, there could be statutory bodies. So the challenges, could anybody comment on the challenges and obviously the potential of trying to get real buy-in there where they proactively want to work with citizen groups and us as researchers?
It's a great question, and thanks for that, Conor. And I think this speaks to the hopeful benefit of having a community of practice, because there's a lot of shared knowledge in the room and a lot of questions that will likely impact an awful lot of people's work. But Francesco, we spoke briefly about when you're engaging with Antashka, for example, first of all, building the trust that you're not trying to take over from them. It's a real collaboration. How do you build that relationship with the body like that?
Well, you see, what we're trying to do is basically in not just with Antashka, but also with other stakeholders. Usually in the projects that we have, especially the one funded by the European Commission, what we use is a legal lab framework. I don't know if you guys are familiar. It's a big buzzword used by the European Commission, but it's basically a human-centered approach, and it's all about stakeholder engagement, and it is about piloting something in real life setting. Okay, a solution. But the fact is that the idea is that you start to co-develop the challenge and the solution with this big group of stakeholders from the beginning. So there is a sense of ownership. So they own the solution. It's not a surprise at the end of your 3-year project that you go there you go, which is going to be rejected. So you build it with them. So at the end of the project, it's not your solution, but it's the solution that you develop together. And so usually you begin these projects with a stakeholder mapping exercise. We try to get them from academia, local authorities, industry, more importantly, local communities, NGOs, And then you have a nice mix of ideas, perspectives. You are able to understand barriers from and drivers from a 360 perspective, and that's how you push it through all the way.
So again, is that a lot of time when
It
you
is a
mapped
lot
out
of
who
time.
the stakeholders are, then developing?
But said that it is a lot of time, but then you have a straight line to policy implementation. So we managed to develop policies not just in Ireland, but in UK, in Finland, in Italy, and so on, in Germany, and so on and so forth, using the same approach.
Okay, great. Mary, about your experience with Loughborough, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I have worked with local community groups, tiny towns associations. I've also been in contact with local authorities. Even recently, I was helped one of the local communities put in an application for funding to the Community Development Fund, and we had to approach local authorities and others for letters of support, and they were freely provided.
Okay.
So they saw the potential of citizen science.
So again, it's letting them know that the research is beneficial to them.
Absolutely.
And it can be impactful. Great, and thank you for that, Conor. Are there further questions from the audience before I go back to the
May I
online?
come back to the point on insurance and just the supervised excavations that I'm familiar with in Wicklow? That's fine when it's supervised, and I think we can get the buy-in from UCD on that. But what if you set your volunteers out to go out and sample wherever? Who covers the insurance there?
Yeah.
Because they're not supervised.
Yeah.
And they may not necessarily be on their own, but of course you've done the proper health and safety training and you provided them safety equipment. But beyond that, I don't know who's responsible.
And if that's potentially a piece of work that needs to be
Major
addressed. Yeah. And Jerry, if we can get the microphone back here, Jane, please.
I just
Thank
wanted
you.
to make a comment based on the building trust and the community engagement and how much work that takes. And it's kind of counter to the way that the university structures are moving now with more service, more teaching. And I think we need more support for, you know, us to be able to build those relationships in the community, to develop the trust. It takes time and takes a lot of effort. And it would be great if UCD acknowledges that in the future and, you know, incorporates that going forward.
So perhaps that's something to bring back to UCD research and engage with UCD in the community and UCD public engagement. Perhaps collectively there might be directions in that. Liz, are there more from online?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions. I don't put my screen.
So it sort of feels like an extension of the questions about relationship and trust, but how to ensure justice during the citizen engagement process. We have sort of touched on that, but if people have more specific comments, that would be quite interesting.
And do you mean, or do you know if the person asking the question means like in terms of social justice and access and equity, or?
So the person who asked is Chiara Peretta, and she just said how to ensure justice. I'll see if she elaborates further.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else?
She said yes, social justice.
Social justice. Okay, so Francesco or Mary, I guess Francesco, what you're working on anyway would fall onto the realms of social justice because it's
yes,
sustainability in you know.
Forget I'm an engineer, so it's I'll be struggling a bit, but well, you see, like
If you talk, for example, about what you're doing with the schools. At
Yeah,
the
that's what I was.
moment.
I was
okay.
just thinking about the school because for us, like as an example now, as I mentioned before, we are deploying 200 bikes in schools. It's called the Bike Library. It's all about families in schools who have access to basically our micro mobility sharing scheme. If you want to use the technical word, because if you go around the city, if you have a kid, you either drive or go. Don't go on the bus if you have a 3-year-old son like me, because it's a nightmare. So what you think? What we do is do something like a library instead of borrowing books, borrow bikes for a long term, and use them and try them. But then all of a sudden, what we are deploying are electric bikes. So is that what is? I mean, I'll be struggling a bit with that part because we are basically getting people to borrow electric bike in an area where maybe these access are actually more expensive than the car that they own. So does it make sense? Is that completely, utopia that doesn't work? So I'm trying to figure out a different kind of
model also for disadvantaged areas to make sure that also there's a potential uptake for them. They don't necessarily need to buy an e-cargo bike at the end. Maybe there is a community scheme that can be used if we give them the bikes at the beginning, so we cover the capital cost at the beginning, and the operational cost can be solved with small rental. So there is an element also social justice also there, I guess, from my perspective. But it is a bit of a struggle, and it's not my specialty. So and so, if any of you has any ideas or suggestions, I'll take them after this, because that'd be helpful.
But I mean, it's such a fabulous project, and as someone who recently borrowed a cargo bike, I think you have to be able to try it before you invest in it. And if it's something that you could share as a community, I just think that
They are €5,000 each.
Yeah.
So that's what I was saying. Like it worked well, maybe in places like Ranelagh or Rathmines that they can afford. But then if you go in other places where that is too much, what it is that, and they still probably they are still driving, so it's still something that needs to be done there. You need to twist a bit. I got to find out a different kind of governance model that works also for them.
Maybe it's something UCD would like to think about, not just borrow books from the library, Sandra, borrow bikes as well.
One of the bikes there.
It can be done though, it can be done. Liz, is there another question?
Yeah,
You say?
So another question from Elga Dias, who asks, how can we scrutinize the citizens' response to ensure that they're not just the result of befriending researchers? So I think this would probably be for more, non-quantitative research, and to convince them to offer something that's sort of like actual neutral information. Does that make sense?
Interesting, but I imagine the data that you're asking them to collect is.
They have a data entry system, so it's essentially quantitative data, some descriptive data there as well. So I don't think it's certainly not an issue for my area.
Actually, we found that citizens to be actually quite brutally honest about our answer. So it's not about finding answers.
Or what I do is they fill in a form, but I also request them to send in photographs of what they have actually sampled. And it's part of what I do in terms of data validation.
Right.
So they're unique to their experience.
I imagine the question of dealing with potential power dynamics, but that's hopefully something that you would deal with in the training and the engagement. And we've got a question here. We'll take that. We'll shortly wrap up. Thanks.
Regarding what you mentioned right now, I'm thinking about, is it possible in citizen science that citizens be in a place that like need to judge about value oriented concepts? Like, for example, in both cases, I see that people are collecting data, very objective concepts, and they don't need to judge or give interpretations about things. But in some cases, especially in urban studies, we have some situations that need citizens to give their understanding or inceptions about phenomena, like, for example, satisfaction about life, or willingness to engage, or sometimes, especially in qualitative research. My question is there any place for citizens to be in such positions in citizen science?
I think that's kind of a theoretical question very much, because I wonder, is it citizen science then if they're generating data that wouldn't otherwise be accessible, or is it collecting them from them as participants in the research?
Yes.
Look, I did a project where I was in Boston, and it was basically around collecting how people information about how people perceive the urban environment, so about feelings.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's related to what you're saying.
Yes, of course.
Basically, we were able to target this using a citizen science approach with an app,
And it was basically about having like geotagging your feelings using a quadrant with different kind of level of emotions in different places. So you were prompted to act, and you were prompted with the question saying, how are you feeling now? Look around, have a look at what are your feelings, and then we were taking a picture and prompting like feelings on the app, and then we were collecting this geolocated data about different people perceive the urban environment, which is surprisingly it changes a lot, because what we were trying is that to prompt people in the same place to get different perceptions of the same place, and they changed a lot even with the weather. So if it was a great day and it was a lot of a great infrastructure, people were feeling like a kind of moody, like a bad mood. The green helped a lot to the perception, but there are strategies, I think, that to be done also in a pervasive way.
Maybe to refer to some of Francesco's publications might be useful. And just on that, actually, the citizens science page will share also Mary's paper that she talked about with the framework.
At the end of the paper, there's a table which lays out the key steps in developing a citizen science program and just what is needed for each of those steps. So if you haven't time to read the full, get those table.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you so much, Francesco. Liz?
Yeah, just one final sort of follow-on question from Geraldine O'Brien online. So she said, I have found when people have filled in surveys, the results are not always reliable. People don't always admit to. So for example, they might say they drink less than they do. And while I realize you're probably not asking about this, but do you think this comes into play in citizen science where maybe you're gathering more information about like how you feel or what you're doing, for example, rather than, you know, the measurement of something in a river?
I think that is a valid question, but I think especially when you have a large numbers of responses, that kind of outlier blows in and lose kind of weight. And I think probably, I mean, my answer is that if you manage to have high numbers of responses, you kind of target to some extent a problem. But then it's my perception.
Can I ask you for just a nugget of takeaway for anybody who's embarking on citizen science projects that you might like to share from your experience now, having done so much work in the field? What would you say, Mary, or what to keep an eye out for, perhaps?
I think the important thing is planning them.
That's great advice. Francesco?
I say over test the primary.
Train.
And overtrain. Very good. Well, thank you sincerely for your time, Francesco Pilla and Mary Kelly-Quinn. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks to the UCD Library and the Earth Institute for organising, and very much looking forward to more events from the citizen science community of practice in UCD. Thanks everybody.
Thank you very much. There's lots of pastry over there, so please take one.
Well, Mary, I think that's got it all in there. Yeah, we will start a test.
That was